Good evening, everybody. I think we've still got a couple more people to join, but I think we'll probably just make a start because Andrew, I know that you need to be away and you're presenting the first paper. And I'd just like to remind folk that the meeting is being recorded, and I'd also like to welcome Kirsty Patterson from the Falkirk Herald, who's joining us as well today. So I'll start today with apologies. Jack, do we have any apologies?
Apologies from Morgan Mack.
Thank you. And do we have any declarations of interest? Sounds very good, thank you. Well, with that, I'm going to go to, which is actually paper 14, and Andrew Murray is going to present Clinical and Care Governance Annual Assurance Statement. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Fiona. Just trying to juggle my screens here, so sorry if I'm being a little bit distracted. So thank you, and thanks for allowing me to go first, so I can get to my next meeting at 10 o'clock. So the Clinical and Care Governance Committee Annual Assurance Statement, as Fiona says, it's agenda item 14 from page 126 onwards. There's a cover paper, and the cover paper just outlines the purpose and the background to the need for an assurance statement. And you'll see within that cover statement in section 3, it talks about internal audit, who recommended that an assurance statement from the various committees, subcommittees from the IGB was received by the IGB on an ongoing basis, and that was agreed. So our yearly statement, I suppose, of assurance is what's coming next. So within section 4, 4.4, it just explains that the groups, the Clinical and Care Governance Committee, although there's in-depth consideration, and I'll just read it out of a broad range of agendas, there is also quite a bit of a maintenance agenda, and by that I mean, you know, as issues arise, there's a need for oversight and understanding and monitoring of improvements. So there's that function as well that Clinical Care Governance serves. Section 4.5 says that we are aware there's further work going to be required to look at not just assurance arrangements, but also in terms of the functions of the clinical care governance. And obviously COVID-19 has had a major impact on our agenda and ability to interact. 4.6 talks a wee bit more about the terms of reference. I know that there is a national discussion going on looking at clinical and care governance. I think we welcome that. It's always been interesting as to how best to place the work of the Health and Social Care Partnership around the governance arrangements, and we see examples of where that's worked well, and then we see examples in areas like Tayside and the Strang report where that's been more challenging. So that's the cover paper, with the conclusion just stating this is the annual assurance statement, so we're all happy we're on the right paper. The actual assurance statement itself is the next section, which is Appendix 1. And again, it sets out in a bit of detail with its own appendices, and you can follow those through to see the types of topics that have been discussed. What I would pick up on is just under section 2.4, you see some bullets. There has really been a ongoing oversight of healthcare acquired infection, the quality and safety of care in both community hospitals. So there's been, I think, just historically, health and the health board has a lot of data that fits with this agenda, and maybe social care has not quite at the same level of data, but that's where we've been working to try and get more of a balance, because you can see those items really do reflect what's been happening in the NHS aspects of the partnership. So that's section 2.4, and then section 3, as I said, is just really the administrative part of it. You can see the membership, the professional advisors, and the model that Falkirk IGB went for, that you went for, was you wanted an official subcommittee of the IGB that was open, and you can see the relative seniority, therefore, of people who are contributing to the Clinical and Care Governance Committee. You can see we've met quarterly, and you can see the items of business in more detail on the Appendix 2, you can see the list of the agendas and the agenda items that have been covered, along with the attendances above that. And I'll just read out the conclusion just for the minute. I suppose assurance and governance provided to a large extent by having an oversight and adequate reporting mechanism from the various NHS committees, public protection groups and health and social care groups within the governance infrastructure. These groups demonstrate in-depth consideration of broad agendas. While much of this is a maintenance agenda, there's also scrutiny of proposed changes, and I think that's a really key thing, that this is a mechanism to allow us to scrutinise and assess the risk of changes to systems. A lot of the Health and Social Care Partnership and the IGB should be about change and transformation, and this is the vehicle to help monitor the risks and ensure the quality and the outcomes, those health outcomes, are really delivered. And I'll just finish reading that sentence. And processes that deliver improvement to the quality of care are delivered by the Health and Social Care Partnership. So that's our assurance statement from the colleagues in the Clinical and Care Governance Committee, which you of course now chair, Fiona, and I'm happy to take any questions. And as I said, there's a range of colleagues on this call who also participate in the work of that committee. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Are there any questions on the report? If you've got any questions, as usual, you can either put in the chat or give me a wave and I'll try to pick you up. Don't think there's any questions. Well, with that, Andrew, thank you very much for presenting that, and also to Sarah for her contribution to the report as well. Is the board happy to note the report? Okay, thank you very much. Thanks very much, Andrew, and I'll let you head off to your next meeting. So we're moving on to the main agenda. We've got a presentation on Stronger Communities by Leslie MacArthur and Jen Kerr. I think what we'll do is, I think it's around about 10 minutes. So if we can take questions after it, I've set aside around 10 minutes for that as well. So with that, I'll pass over to Jen and Leslie, and I believe there's some slides are coming up.
Yeah, so we have a presentation of a few slides, just no longer than 10 minutes. I think we just want to share with you guys some of our learning around our work with communities and the partnerships, sort of really get back to the partnership strategy and our aims and what we want to do, and just kind of ask this board just to consider about our way forward and how we might continue to work so well with communities as we have in the last 6 months, during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So our partnership currently has a really strong fourth priority for strong and stable communities. We recognise that resilience and strong communities and self-reliance, both at an individual and at a community level, is really good for health and well-being. We've said and we've committed in our strategy and our partnerships that we want to support this, and we have done a lot of work. We have funded, we have commissioned, we have developed strategies for participation and engagement. We spent a lot of time considering how we might go about this. We were looking at it through locality planning as well. And we actually also have a Stronger Communities working group within the partnership that encompasses a huge variety of people from community and third sector and from the partnerships services as well, including locality managers. And then the pandemic happened and we changed a lot. We learned a lot and we shifted a lot of our thoughts on this. And actually, we're going to talk to you a bit about our learning today. And I think probably for me, the one thing that I've learned is we actually have a lot less to do than we thought we did. Next slide, please. Communities took a lot of leadership early on in the pandemic to support their neighbours. And we, as professional partners, stood back and supported that and asked how we can help. And we did that. Our communities and the organisations in the third sector that support our communities of interest as well just did what they needed to look after people. And one of the things that I learned through all of that process over the last 6 months is that we share an accountability for people and their well-being with our communities of geography and of interest. And actually, we share that equally in the sense of how responsible and accountable we feel for looking after one another. Where we see an inequality as a partnership, they see a neighbour they want to help. One of them actually said to me the other day, if everybody in this country knew something about their neighbours 3 doors up and 3 doors down, this whole country would be a really different place to live and a much better place to live. We'd all be a lot happier as well. So I don't know, it just I suppose it depends on your neighbour. But actually, that's what they did during the pandemic. They knocked on doors. They got to know their neighbours. They got to know a lot about their neighbours. And they would then come back as organisers and community volunteers to third sector forums, and they would raise issues that you would expect to hear in our strategic partnership work groups. They would talk to us about vulnerability, safety and risk, respect for privacy, duplication of services, waste of resources, sustainability of actual resources, and creating dependency on their support and services that they were providing at the time. I have to admit, I was really surprised by this, because that's the kind of stuff we talk about in our partnerships, but actually, as they were out knocking on doors, these were naturally intrinsic things that they were just bringing up about their neighbours and about how they wanted to help them, and that they recognised this was a special time, a unique emergency, and they couldn't just keep providing these services forever, and that this was expensive. I was quite impressed with that. So what I learned through that, and through talking to them and supporting them and working with them through this crisis, was that actually this is their space as much as it's ours. These community organisers, these community organisations, they're our colleagues in this work. They're not our stakeholders. They're not stakeholders in our work. We're stakeholders in their work as much as they're stakeholders in ours. It's their neighbours, their social networks, and their relationships that they mobilise to make things happen, to help one another. That's the assets that we talk about a lot in our asset-based approaches. The more we as a partnership support them to develop those assets, the more they can offer back to the health and wellbeing objectives of this partnership, because we all want to help make people better, the communities as well as ourselves. So that subtle shift of paradigm, that's what we mean by equal partnership. We're colleagues, we're community colleagues, not stakeholders. We work shoulder to shoulder with people. That's when we say equal partnership, that's what we mean. And that's probably the first time I've seen that in practice. And it was nice to work with. And actually, what it also did was it helped us learn a lot more about communities. So it had a very practical benefit to partnerships, aims and objectives. Knocking and getting to know their neighbours raised a whole bunch of questions for community organisers. They learned about the inequalities that people faced and the hardships people faced. They raised a lot of people that were just slightly under the radar, the ones we worry about, the prevention, the aims of prevention. They talked about helping people manage conditions while they were at home. Deal with poverty, the impacts of health inequalities and that poverty can bring forward. So we also saw then, as they raised these issues and talked about different types of inequality, that we had to work with communities to find appropriate services for the right person at the right time. That wasn't the language they used, but we recognize and they recognize there's different levels of vulnerability, people shielding versus people who were just stuck at home in isolation, but actually quite happy to refer on to a wee community group that could do their shopping for them and hand over money. Maybe not so much for a really vulnerable elderly person at home. So we developed a composite set of services. So the more formal, the more vulnerable somebody was, the more of a formal service they got. They got a third sector service, had been PVG'd and trained to deal with, maybe dementia, or were supporting carers on a regular basis. And so if they didn't really need high levels of support, they got a low level community-led service. Both the support for people line understood this, as well as the community organisers. And when someone ended up in the wrong place, everybody challenged it and they got shifted about to the right place. So we didn't have a plan for that. It came up, we recognised it, we worked together and did something about it. And it resulted in what we believe is everyone getting some support that they needed. We don't feel that people were left alone and with needs. They knew where they could go, and if they ended up anywhere, they'd end up in the right place. So what we learned that working with communities as colleagues and developing things with them really helped us achieve our aims, and it also freed up the Health and Social Care Partnership to focus on the really important things it had to focus on during COVID. And we let communities get on in their world, and we enabled that, and we supported it with professional help and advice and resources where either we saw it was needed or it was asked for from us, and it was asked for from us. And I think that gave me a lot of reassurance that we could do this together quite differently in the future. And I'd like to sort of challenge the partnership to think about in your questions how, as a board, we can ensure that that continues to happen and that we maintain that relationship going forward. I'm going to hand you over to Leslie now to talk a wee bit about the things we have done and how we've commissioned and supported a good, strong, stable base to take this forward.
Thanks, Jen. Next slide, please. I'm just going to briefly cover some of the areas of operational service that we might be able to take learning from the COVID experience or the COVID time. In 2019, the Ministerial Group for Health and Community Care presented the framework that you can see on your screen just now, and it was intended to show accelerated integration from the perspective of the service user. The framework provides a really helpful reference point to highlight how we can apply learning taken from COVID in the context of the way that we work with communities going forward. I'm going to focus on the 3 pillars that sit below the characteristics of effective integrated care, and I'm keen to highlight that the contribution of all partners can help us achieve better outcomes. Next slide, please. So the first pillar is about supporting healthy, independent living. During the past year, the Stronger Communities Steering Group has had an oversight on the community work that's been progressed within the partnership. The group brings together the assets of partners in terms of expertise and knowledge to work in a solution-focused way and to progress a range of work streams that contribute to the strategic plan. Examples of these work streams are shown at the top half of the slide. As Jen mentioned, there's a really broad membership on the group, and most importantly, service users and carers representatives are also part of that. Our experience during COVID has seen the broadening of this asset-based, solution-focused approach within communities. Communities in Falkirk mobilised really quickly in March. With the shared outcome to support vulnerable people, communities brought together social networks and local knowledge to effectively start to develop their own solutions. The Health and Social Care Partnership, Falkirk Council, NHS and CVS Falkirk in turn provided specialist support and financial resource to enable this to happen. The result of this enabling approach taken by partners has been the communities have taken pride in their self-resilience and self-reliance, and many of the groups that formed during COVID now want to continue to operate. Next slide, please. Pillar 2 relates to integrated and collaborative working practice. In 2019-20, a community link work pilot was established across the 3 localities in Falkirk. The link workers are hosted by third sector organisations and are aligned to GP practices within areas of high deprivation and health inequality. An important factor to the success of the pilot has been that the link workers have been embedded within the practice team. As a parallel, during COVID, community groups worked shoulder to shoulder with partner agencies. The contribution of community colleagues has been recognised and valued as an important part within the spectrum of support available to help health and wellbeing whilst targeting inequality. Next slide, please. The third pillar relates to accessible services. One of the priorities of the Stronger Communities Group was to consider how people can access services, the right services in the right place at the right time. The Living Well Centre based in Forth Valley Sensory Centre provides functional assessment for people who have experienced reduced mobility. This early and preventative intervention also helps to link people to community supports and to help avoid requirement of formal input from statutory services. Before COVID, work had been progressed to extend this work to each locality to develop community access hubs. It's intended that these hubs will be led by communities and supported by both statutory and third sector organisations, again providing that spectrum of support. As mentioned, people already experiencing inequalities have been impacted more significantly by the pandemic. Learning has highlighted the importance of understanding scales of vulnerability at the first point of contact. Community groups and networks recognise the range of vulnerability and establish links with services early on so that those with a higher level of need could be referred onwards. I'm going to hand back to Jen, thank you.
Next slide, please. Oh, thanks. So I think that shows some great examples of how, as a partnership, we were already well on this journey and thinking about how we work differently with others. But I think it's not even about the structures and the services we put in place. It's more about how we go about them and the leadership roles and the sharing of the accountability. That for me is what the subtle difference was during COVID. We just worked alongside people shoulder to shoulder. We didn't plan a lot of what happened. It just happened. But we still managed to help to work together to help it happen safely, and to learn from what we were learning on the ground as we went along. Because we will learn a lot more when we work together in this way, and more people can come forward and access support that they need. But when we went back to the strategy itself, we had a good look through it to see where we thought about how we want to work differently with others. And actually, these are our principles of how we want to work across all of our strategic priorities and aims and outcomes in the strategy. And actually, all of it absolutely mirrors the slide I put up earlier about our learning. Co-production, culture based on trust and empowerment, a focus on communities, people being treated as equals, good advice and information in the right place that's proportionate and delivers good outcomes. This is exactly what we said we want to do. And we've done it in a microcosm during the pandemic. We are really committed now as a working group and as a partnership to continue to work that way with others. But we recognize that we are going to have to still explore with our communities and within our partnership what that might mean for us. So that's all I think we probably want to say about our experience and our learning, and hope that gives you a lot to reflect on and think about. And you've got some good questions for us. I'll leave you with just one last slide, actually, sorry. And this is just some customer and service user feedback, we'll call it, because I think this says more than either Leslie or I could about what happened and how it helped people. Give me a minute to read that before you answer questions.
Thank you very much for that. I think that you know that response from somebody about the support they got really does recognise. I mean the depth of things that happened during COVID. I mean I know in my own ward, you know, it sprung up organically. There was nothing that the partnership did that made this happen. This was people wanting to help other people, and the support of CVS and CLD and some of the more formal groups that set up, and you know, community kitchen and things like that. But I know that there are other things springing up as a result of that, actually, just because people have been talking and thinking about what the next steps might be. One group set up a football group for men to help support mental health and weight management. So you know, there's some really good things starting, and it's how we continue to support that and as the light touch away as possible, I think, as well, which is very important. So I'm going to open it up for questions. I'm going to try and time this, so because obviously we've got quite a full agenda. But does anyone have any questions? Alison.
It was a really good report to see, and I think that the community groups identifying all those issues themselves, I think it shows the level of expertise they've got about what they're doing in the communities that they're representing. I think that it's really important that we do more of this, and we do encourage these groups to keep going, because the low-level stuff they're doing just now prevents a lot of expense later on from the statutory services having to take over. And I think one of the things I was impressed about in the food pantry I worked in was the amount of cooperation between the different food pantries, and also like SIP, other CORA, other agencies that we work with, other community groups, that they all just came together and were so eager to help each other out in any way that they could. And I just think for me it was a great learning experience, and I didn't actually realise the power that was in our communities till I saw that happen. And again, CVS, the amount of work that you've done in leadership and the amount of care that your staff and your organisation is taking has been really impressive. So thanks a lot to Jen and your team.
Thank you.
Sarah.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to Jen and Leslie for a really interesting and really comforting presentation. I think which really kind of shows the confidence that we know we have in communities, and I'm really hoping that communities now have the confidence in us in terms of how we've supported them. Jen, you mentioned that when people needed to be redirected, it's really important to get them to the right place. And Leslie also talked about the right time. And those are principles that are really, really close to my heart, and they are really pretty difficult to achieve at the best of times. So I'm wondering how you manage that throughout COVID, and just thinking forward to any potential second waves, local, national lockdowns, what learning might we need to put around making sure that where people have to be redirected, that we do have the services in place to be able to reach them at the right time. Thanks.
The organisations themselves talked quite a lot, especially the food projects, about, and like they like the support for people line, because if they really didn't know, that's where they sent them, because they knew that there they would get the right place. And then the support for people line was getting information from third sector service providers through CBS, but also through CLD, about what was available on the ground. And if there was a gap, we were all able to highlight that and address it pretty quickly through our coordinators group. And there was very few problems we couldn't solve. But what they started to talk about was, did they as organizations, recognizing that what they called more than through the door, so they were at people's door, they could encourage people to phone welfare benefits or get advice if they were needing more income, or if they had a care issue. And actually quite often, sometimes they would just phone me or us. And I've said this a few times, it's the first time in probably 10 years I've had to support someone to put in an adult protection issue and send them in the right way. They were hearing, unfortunately, there was some instances of domestic violence heard through doors, and those reports were made. So positive things as well. But I think it was, they struggled with that at first, but really started to talk about it as a group of organizations. We are more than through the door. We're at people's door. How can we make best use of that? We're trusted. We don't want to take advantage of it. We're not interested in nosing into people's privacy, and they're very guarded about that. But actually, should they learn some generalist skills about what's out there? Should we be providing them with a list, or is it better to have one place where there's experts in the system, like link workers, where we help steer people through what is out there? That's a question we didn't answer, to be honest, but I think it's a good one for us to talk about. I have to say, one of the biggest things that our organization did that took us, it was hard for us as well, was managing information about what was going on. It took us weeks to phone people every day and find out, because it changed pretty regularly as well. It was hard work, but it was really incredibly valuable. And I have to say, I'm almost back to saying it's worth investing in good quality information about who's doing what and who can help. And it also helped to share that information and increase flexibility for people. So I had some feedback yesterday that by attending a third sector forum, a group chose not to go into an area of over provision because they learned their colleagues were doing it already, that they could be much more useful by going door to door and making sure young people weren't bored. And that's what they chose to do and focus all their time and resources on, because they'd heard from their colleagues that there was enough food provision by coming to a meeting. So something about having information and sharing it. And the first few weeks, we just did that because people kept asking us for stuff, and we're like, oh, we don't know, we better go find out. So it was actually quite reactive of us. I'll call it leadership, but it was just reactive. People kept asking us, I don't know, we better figure that out. But actually that was really hard work, and it took a lot of investment, and that's all my team did for the first 3 weeks, really. So yeah, it is possible, but behind the scenes, between that and then the daily meeting with all of our public sector partners in the coordinating group, we were then able to bring resources to the things that did come up and find ways to do them.
Oh, I'm on mute. Can I bring Cecil in and then Gordon?
Thank you, Fiona. I think in Falkirk we've had a number of incidents where we know now we've got good community resources, we've said, and we need to be able to continue to harness that going forward. But I think what we've really got from this is some really good intelligence about what's important to people. And now what we need to do is to take that to the next stage and say, right, okay, this is what's important, but who's best to deliver that? Is it the council? Is it the Health and Social Care Partnership? Is it the NHS? Or is it the community of the third sector? And that way we actually start to share the responsibilities. And I think what we will then find is those, particularly the low level needs, will start to be delivered at the most appropriate point which is as close to home as possible. But I think that there's a fantastic work being done in pulling the intelligence we've gathered together. But we now need to look at how we take that and use that and work with the communities as a partner and actually developing, delivering services for the future. Knowing that the public sector, the statutory organisations are going to be pressured, particularly financially, but we're also going through transition. But taking up those opportunities where that self-help and local help can actually make a real difference, because it can actually be far richer than what we can deliver as a statutory organisation.
Thanks, Tess. Can I bring in Gordon and then Patricia?
Yeah, it was on a similar line, really, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. As someone who was a community development worker in a past life, I was both delighted and not surprised to see that the approach you've taken was successful. I guess my question is about how we move this excellent approach. And for me, I mean, harking back to Alison's point about this not really being low-level work, but being vital preventative work that stops lots of problems emerging at an early stage. I guess the question is, how do we move from this being a pandemic response at the time when there is a threat which galvanises people and a ready source of volunteers when there are people who are off work and looking for something to do? How do we move this from pandemic response to simply being business as usual?
I think that's exactly what we want to make sure happens. And what we learned, some of our intelligence is people want to help even when they have to work during the day. A lot of our organisers actually held down full-time jobs while they volunteered to do this at the same time. And I know pandemic situation is different, but people are willing to do lots of extra time because they care. And I think it's just about, rather than having plans, and we were actually laughing at one point about in May, I think it was, we were about to start an isolation strategy. It probably would have been a 2-year strategy. It would have been very, quite a bit of money behind it. Actually, we now have hundreds of people that want to make sure their neighbors are looked after, and and they've not asked us for a penny yet. And why were we starting that strategy? So some of that, I think, is about looking how we actually plan stuff, and maybe just doing it more through a conversational approach of, well, this is from our perspective, this is an issue. What do you guys think? Giving people the space to make an offer to help before we assume that this is what they want to help with. I think in some ways, by coming out with a plan, we stop people being able to come forward and make an offer to help. At least have that conversation first and then make plans after, if nothing else. I mean, we do need plans. I'm not saying get rid of plans, but at least have that conversation of what are you willing to help? What can you help with? And actually what we found is resource-wise, people are very entrepreneurial in communities. There was no food, for example, in those food projects. The government food funding and resources came in sort of second week of April. Those organizations managed to feed people still for almost 4 weeks without any support, financial or otherwise. They did it entrepreneurially. It was incredible to watch, actually.
Thanks, Jen. I'll bring in Patricia and I'll make that final question, okay?
Thank you, Chair. I think the key in these discussions is about empowerment, and actually we've been able through COVID and our response to COVID to really fast track, and it's taken down a lot of the perceived barriers in the system. We have opportunities now, but it's a limited window that we have. We need to capture that energy and galvanise the communities and take on the feedback, the valuable feedback that Jen and Leslie have presented, and how we feed that into the pieces of work across the system and the Community Planning Partnership and the Council as well. The Council has just done some engagement. How do you layer in this other really important information and data that you've gathered? I think the framework that featured in the slides that Leslie talked to, that's a national framework, and that's really useful framework for us to evaluate what we're doing. We've just appointed our third locality manager for the partnership, so we will have the integrated locality teams up and running for the first time. And I would see a challenge for those locality managers and those teams to be immersed in what's going on in the community and empowering the communities to identify local need in the way that Jen has described and find those innovative ways of meeting that need in a graduated way, that where there are formal services required, those are provided, but supporting that entrepreneurial and innovative spirit that there is within the communities, that's where we'll get sustainable solutions. So I think this has given us an energy in the system, but the challenge for us as a system and as partners is how do we galvanise and support that energy to be sustained into some longer term real solutions within the communities. So thank you, Jen and Leslie. I think it was a really important presentation for us to see today, and certainly given us a lot of food for thought, but more importantly, stimulus for action. So thank you.
Jen?
If I can just say one thing, so there is still a need for bureaucracy and structure, but how we use that with communities needs to change, I think, a little bit too. So one thing this partnership can do is make sure that those communities understand what we see as issues for people in terms of health and well-being, and then rather than making plans and asking them what they think of those plans, ask them first how they think they can help resolve that, and if they share that experience, and then make the plan with them. And I think that's where locality at that level, and locality managers developing those and the understanding of what's happening in those localities with communities and coming up with solutions together is perhaps our action way forward, rather than us coming up with a plan and asking people what to think of it.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Leslie, as well. That was a really useful presentation and discussion, and I'm sure that the discussion will continue on and on about how we take this forward. So thank you very much. So with that, I'm going to move on to agenda item 4, which is the minutes. And I just want to check, has anyone got any corrections to the minute? And if not, are we happy to agree the minute? Okay, thank you. I'm assuming we're agreed. There's no comments to the contrary. And our action log, and I know that this has been updated. Does anyone have any comments or questions from the action log? No? Well, we'll just agree that, and with that, I'm going to move on to the Chief Officer report, which is a very full and detailed report from Patricia.
Thank you, Chair. Members of the board, you'll see before you the report, which gives you an update on current developments within the partnership and also on our pandemic response. You will see in section 4 outlined our response to COVID-19, also the regular meetings that myself and the Chief Finance Officer have been having with the Chair and the Vice Chair. And included in that regular financial updates. We've also provided an update on our Remobilise Redesign, Recover and Redesign plan within section 4.4, and that outlines the progression of the work that we detailed in the plan submitted to you in June, just to highlight the ongoing work around the community bed-based modelling. We've now had 2 workshops on that and extensive data from that around modelling for the community hospital beds, but also our demographic pressures and our model for nursing and residential care, as well as looking at the models of care for prevention of hospital admission, including enhanced hospital team and also hospice at home. And we're proposing to have a specific development session in the next few weeks to present that information to you, which will underpin the review and redesign of not only the community hospital beds, but also our residential and commissioning of care home beds. Just to draw to your attention as well that we have been able to reopen or open additional respite beds in Thornton Gardens since the middle of June, and so we've been able to offer that respite care for a number of individuals within the system to help address some carer stress. We've also highlighted to you the ongoing care inspection inquiry in relation to care at home and housing with care during the pandemic. We have, in addition to that, we've completed lessons learned exercises around our interim COVID response, and we'll be bringing that report to the Clinical and Care Governance Committee in November. In section 5, there's an outline of various service updates, including NHS Forth Valley's Rebuild and Reset Unscheduled Care Programme. This is a national direction that's coming out as an emerging learning from the COVID response to look at trying to plan more unscheduled care and having a 24/7 response for urgent care through NHS 24 line, and then further triaging through a flow navigation centre, and that's detailed in 5.5. This is a piece of work that's emerging at pace, and colleagues are developing that urgent care model, and we're proposing to take that to the strategic planning group to take soundings from them on the proposals and feed that back into the development, and we'll update the board on that in November. In section 6, we're describing the work that I've already indicated on the new models of care within community hospitals in relation to the enhanced care model that we've already presented, and it's in there again at 6.2. There's a report elsewhere in the agenda on Torwood Hall, and that's part of that element of redesign, particularly in the light of some of the learning from COVID, but colleagues will speak to that further on. But it's just to give the board some reassurance, and it's in the report, that we are working across Forth Valley in a very collaborative whole system way to look at the models of care across the system, to improve the care within the community and to improve our use of our different assets in terms of supporting the community, what needs bed-based care, and actually how do we have a much broader reablement and intermediate care offer. And we'll bring reports back to the board on all of those elements. So to move to the recommendations in the report. Members of the board are asked to note the content of the report, also to agree to continue to delegate authority to myself and the Chief Finance Officer to be reviewed in November 2020. That's on the basis that the COVID emergence of new cases of COVID, as you'll be aware in the press, are popping up all over Scotland, and it's just so that we have the delegated authority in place should we need it to respond if we do go into a second wave. We've not needed to use those delegated powers for anything significant, except for the partnership funding, which was presented to the board earlier in the year. But it's just, I think, wise that we have that contingency there should it be required in partnership with the Chair and the Vice Chair. Also at 2.3, to support the review of the in-house residential care homes, as outlined in that recommendation, and finally to delegate the Chair, Vice Chair, myself and the Chief Finance Officer to approve the publication of the annual performance report. And I've been remiss in not highlighting that to you. We are required to produce an annual performance report. Normally we do that in June, but as a result of COVID, we postponed that, as have other partnerships. We're aiming to have that out by the end of this month, but given the other time pressures, it's been too tight to get the report to this meeting, and so we're asking that you delegate authority as outlined, and we will bring the performance report to the next meeting so that you can scrutinise that at the next meeting. So thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Patricia. I mean, I think that it outlines the breadth of work that is happening at the moment, and I don't underestimate the amount of time and energy that's involved, particularly around the flu immunisation and a significantly extended programme alongside everything else that is currently going on. I've got one question before I open it up to further questions, is around the care inspector at National Inquiry. Do we know when the government is going to report on that? And I know it said that the information had to be into the government in August 2020, and obviously the partnership has done that, but whether there's a timescale for how the care inspector reports, do we have anything?
I'm not aware of that timeframe. I'll maybe defer to Suzanne. She may know. It had to be done in very short order, but that was now a few weeks ago, and I'm not aware of any target publication date on that. I don't know if Suzanne has any more information on that. Suzanne?
Yeah, sorry, I don't have any more information. The timescales that were given at the time were for end of August for a national report to be published and presented. So obviously that's slipped. So I would suspect it's imminent, but we can check that up and put a note out to members after the meeting.
So, Sarah, I saw you waving there.
Thanks, Chair. I then started to type. I spoke to the care inspector about this week, so the report has been submitted to the Cabinet Secretary, and the expectation is there'll be publication by the end of September. We're taken and laid in Parliament by end of September. I think that might be subject to some change. I certainly asked if there was any particular highlights that they would wish to share with us, but they didn't choose to share any highlights with me.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I just quickly want to comment on the delegated authority, and just to say that and Michelle and I are meeting with Gillian and Patricia every 2 weeks. We were meeting weekly, and just to give that assurance that we are supporting the Chief Officer and Chief Finance Officer in their work at the moment. So can I open it up to questions? Alison?
With regarding 6 point, I think it must be 6.1, some of the councillors have been asking about going forward. I know we've got a housing policy for the Health and Social Care Partnership, but the Falkirk Community Hospital, it looks like a good site. I know it's not our site, but it looks like a good site for older people's housing. And then because most of our older people are concentrated in the high flats, and you sometimes have to ask yourself, is that ideal? So I don't know if maybe this could be looked at for going forward for older people's housing as well.
I don't think Cathy Cowan's on the call, but I had a meeting with Cathy yesterday, and we've been talking in the broadest terms about the piece of work around the reviews of the community hospital and the potential redevelopment of that site, but also critically the alignment of the strategic needs assessment for primary care along with the strategic property review with the council. I'm going to be heavily involved in leading some of that project, and we will strive to make sure that we bring that together. Already Douglas Duff and the team meet with Jonathan Proctor and the team on a more regular basis, and the three of us have had a couple of meetings now, so we'll be looking to try and dovetail as much as we can on that piece of work. And I think Hubco have supported us to fund the consultants to do the community bed-based modelling, and they're doing that across Forth Valley, and we're already working in a very collaborative way, so I'd be optimistic that we would be able to have those types of discussions about the potential use of that site, notwithstanding obviously the Health Board and Scottish Government Health Directorate will have particular views on that.
Does that answer that okay for you, Alison? Yeah. Any other questions? Kenneth?
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. I suppose it's picking up on that sort of theme, and particularly section 6 of the report. And at 6.4, Patricia, you rightly say that, emerging from what we've been through, there is that unique opportunity to reshape services and infrastructure, and all that work around about the looking at the bed-based model of care is really welcome. I suppose an interesting point from my perspective is, of course, we had the announcement in the programme for government about the independent review of adult social care, and that's a very interesting and important piece of work which will influence future services. But I suppose the reassurance I'd be looking for is that we're not waiting for that to happen, but we're going to try and take advantage of the opportunity there is to really accelerate some of that transformation of services that we know is going to be of benefit to our communities, and that we're not going to kind of hold back on that because of the potential shifts in the national position, that we need to continue along that that positive journey of change. And indeed, given recent events, there's opportunities to enhance that.
Thank you, Kenneth. I think pragmatically, any change and establishment, if the outcome is a national care service, that will take a number of years to establish. I think it's incumbent on us as a partnership to continue along our strategic plan, but be mindful of any of those national policy changes or developments. But we can improve outcomes for the people who currently need our services. The opportunities that COVID has provided have, as outlined in the earlier presentation, have enabled us to accelerate really key pieces of work and ambitions that we had specifically for the partnership. Geriatricians now out working in the community. We're looking at the clinical leadership across the community hospitals, also the support for care homes, the care assurance work, which has been tremendous in this area and has been recognised nationally, has allowed us now to look at, well, actually, what do we need going forward in terms of formally and regularly doing more care assurance, but also what's the support for medical cover for those care homes. The work on hospital at home, but also the work that we're doing, the NHS and ourselves are doing a review of palliative care as well. So really looking at what do we need in the community to meet escalating needs, whether that's individuals on an end-of-life trajectory or people who actually have a long-term life-limiting condition. We know we've currently got a significant number of people under 65 who are in care homes, and actually we need to redress that and look at how we can support them through more supported housing or more appropriate care arrangements, and not a limited choice of a care home. So there's a lot of work that we need to be advancing, which I would see synergises with what I know of the national agenda, but we can improve outcomes for people by looking at the general direction of travel, which is about trying to support more people to live as independently as possible for as long as they would want to in their own homes. And I don't see that national vision changing dramatically. We do know from COVID anecdotally, and the safest place for people over 75 appeared to be in their own homes. And actually we need to look at the evidence around the size and the nature of care home provision and the type of care that we provide. So I think there's enough scope for us as a partnership to keep going in the direction that we're going, but obviously being mindful of the national developments. Because looking at our financial challenges, and the next paper will come on to that, we really need to look at that we've got our resources in the right place, and that we're aligning the resources with our strategic plan, but also critically with need. And that's incumbent on us for both delivering for the NHS budget, but also for the council budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. And I think that certainly reflects, I know, of the national agenda as well, and the work that's been going on for, I think, a good couple of years around the reform of adult social care, involving people-led panels as well, so it's very much led by individuals who use services. So I think while some of this work is going on, I think that direction of travel I can't imagine that suddenly changing significantly. It may be around structures and how it's delivered, but let more not that that direction of travel, about people at the heart and people making choices about their own care, and we'll have a bit self-directed support later on in the agenda. So thanks, Patricia. Do you have any other questions or comments? Alison, is something else? No, but you're waving there. Okay. Well, with that, can we agree the recommendations? Thank you very much. And I'm going to move on to agenda item 7. And Martin and Nikki Harvey is also here as well. Welcome, Nikki. And I think Jack is going to put up a couple of photos of Torwood Hall, just so you get a bit of a picture of what we're talking about today.
If I could interject there, Fiona. We thought it would be helpful, and Councillor Black suggested that it might be helpful for board members to see a couple of photographs of Torwood Hall, so you've got a sense of what type of building it is and what the facility is like, rather than discussing something in the theoretical. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning. As the Chair said, I'm joined today by Nikki Harvey, who is our Home First manager. Nikki's here really to answer any specific operational questions that you may have about the proposed review. Really, I'm just going to highlight a few points from the report. Hopefully you've had a chance to read it and considered some questions. But I guess, as you'll recall, back in, I think it was December last year, when we brought forward the delivery plan for this year and subsequent years, we already planned to review our residential care homes. Now, that was in light, I guess, as Patricia has already highlighted, we've always known that people thrive more in their own homes than they do in our residential homes. And we've also known that we place far more people into care homes in Falkirk than they do in the national average. So we plan to review these homes anyway. The impact of COVID really affected many of our resources, but particularly our residential care homes. Care homes, by their very nature, are not clinical settings, and yet we knew these would be the hardest hit from COVID-19. And the challenge really is, how can you make a home more clinical? And we have really struggled in a number of areas. You will know that the partnership's done some really good joint working with public health, alongside the Chief Social Work Officer and the care home sector, really looking to how we can protect care homes from COVID. It's really important that we put in place really strong infection prevention and control measures, that we zone people when people are displaying signs and symptoms of COVID, that we remove them, I guess, from the wider population within the care home. Now, some care homes are better set up to do that than others, and as you've seen from the photographs, Torwood Hall is a particularly old building. Zoning within that home is really difficult, and getting that building to be, I guess, very clinical is going to be a real challenge for us. So I guess what the partnership has looked at is that possible? And given the building layout, its configuration, is really difficult in that building. So given that we know some of the challenges around COVID are going to be longer term, and we know that we have a real need to protect vulnerable older people, particularly within care home settings, we've decided, I guess, that we need to bring forward the review of Torwood Hall, particularly. It's one of the few buildings that the partnership own that we would really struggle to zone, that we would really struggle to ensure that they have adequate infection control. Luckily, I have to say that throughout COVID, there have been no incidences of COVID-19 within Torwood Hall. But that, I think, has been more down to luck and how staff have really struggled to manage the situation rather than through any design within the building. We have, as I said, already known that we have to review our care home sector. We are doing some work in partnership with the NHS and with Buck and Associates to look at the entire bed-based model across Falkirk, but we felt that we needed to look particularly at Torwood Hall in this first instance. We do have a very good staff group within that. The recent Care Inspectorate inspection highlighted a really high level quality of care that we provide, and that's something that's been consistent over the past few years. But the Care Inspectorate have never actually gone in and looked at the building and the fabric of the building, and we believe if they do that, they would highlight the challenges that we will have around infection control and zoning in particular. So I guess the ask of the partnership is to allow us to undertake a review of Torwood Hall in terms of its appropriateness, and I'll just scroll to the recommendations. I really struggle with only having one laptop off, does it? Give me a second. So the recommendations for the board are that you are asked to support a review of Torwood Hall that would consider all the current residents' needs and the provision of care in alternative settings, that you note that this work will include deep engagement with residents and their families. We will support that with independent advocacy where required. We will engage fully with the staff and the trade unions. You're asked to note the report, and we plan to bring back a report to the IGB at the November meeting. As I said, I've asked Nikki Harvey to join us today. She has been involved with the operational management of Torwood Hall for a number of years, and she is also going to lead on the review for us. Happy to take any questions for either myself or for Nikki. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Martin, and I think in relation to the engagements of with residents and families and independent advocacy, I think we have a very good model that was undertaken in relation to day services, and I know Nikki was very strongly involved with that, which really fully involved people in decisions about what the future looked like. So I feel very comforted by that, and it's great to see you, Nikki. Does anyone have any questions on the paper? Cecil.
Thank you, Fiona. This is just about the public relations around this, and that I have no issues with the process, the engagement with the families and the residents. That is less of a concern to me because we have done that very well in the past and it's been very successful. What I am a bit concerned about is the misinformation that may be put out into the public domain about why this review is going on. So I think we need to be very clear about the comms that's going out about why we're doing this review, the fact that the level of care was absolutely excellent within this. It's the environmental infrastructure that prevents us being able to ensure that that particular level of care is able to be maintained just because of the logistics. I'm just a wee bit anxious about that, and I just think we need to make sure that we get that very, very clear and manage that well.
Patricia, you want to come in there?
Thank you. I think that's an important point. It is just helpful to remind members that this facility was at level 5 in the Care Inspectorate rating. Excellent rating and the level of care. This is not about the quality of the care, and it's testament to everyone involved that there was no COVID transmission or COVID in among the residents. But what we are considering here is how we'd be able to respond should that occur. And there's the physical building is very limited in accommodating these new expectations that we would have about how we would respond if we did have COVID in that care home among the residents. So it's very much a preemptive strike. I think the context is this has already been in the strategic plan, not specifically, but the review has been agreed in the strategic plan last year, and this is us proposing that we focus on this particular facility at this time as part of our consideration of all factors in relation to this care home. But it's absolutely would be based on a very high level of engagement and discussion with the residents and their families and carers and independent advocates in terms of what each individual needs and how we would be able to meet that need if we could better meet it in another location. We would also be very mindful of trying to sustain the consistency of care if another partnership facility was deemed to be the most suitable place for that person's care. So it is very much about us being preemptive in terms of this being one residential facility that we feel we should look at first and at this time.
Thank you, Patricia. I think Angela to come in at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. I just wanted to pick up, support Martin's paper and pick up Cecil's point. I think just of this is just absolutely vital, and we've heard through the board the work that colleagues have already done in handling really sensitive politically and family needs questions. So I just wanted to support that. I just wanted to support the issue particularly around infection control, and I think Patricia's also highlighted the high quality of care that's been given in there. So I think there is probably a degree of luck, Martin, I would agree with that, but what we have found working alongside the colleagues in there is that they have done every single thing they can to keep the residents safe within that environment. And the zoning, as well as infection control, the zoning is around the quality of life for residents whilst trying to protect them with infection control. So I really just wanted to support the paper, support the deep engagement and handling that colleagues will do, as well as the communication, and an amazing team in there. I know that my staff with Patricia and Martin's staff have found just working alongside them, they've been tremendous and they give tremendous care, but as everyone said, needs a different kind of facility. So they've worked hard, and that's probably what's helped their luck, I have to say. So, but yeah, the risks as Patricia and Martin have laid out.
Thank you, Angela.
Can
Michelle?
Yeah, I don't have a hand to stick up for some reason. I don't know if everyone else does, but anyhow, and really just to reiterate what's been said, and I know, Fiona, you and I spent quite some time looking over this paper prior to actually coming out post pre-agenda, and we were both very keen, and I think the paper captures this really well, that we were both really very keen that the paper you know, that the paper didn't worry anyone, it didn't present anyone with problems. And, you know, I think that the paper comes across really well that, you know, what we have said is we'll consider the current residents' needs and the provision of care in an alternative setting. And, you know, from our perspective, as long as that's done, I'm certainly very happy to agree to the recommendations. But I know from conversations we've had, I take comfort in the fact that we've heard such good things about the way the establishment is managed and that type of thing. So certainly I think this can only be a good thing for all concerned.
Thank you, Michelle. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? No? Well, in that case, are we happy to agree the recommendations? Just muted myself again. Thank you very much. And with that, can we move on to the finance report? Gillian.
Thanks. The paper provides an overview of the financial position as at the 30th of June, so for that first quarter of the financial year. There's a number of areas I would draw to your attention in the report, the first being around the annual budget. So you'll see in section 3 of the report that the annual budget increased by just over £10 million since it was last presented to the IJB. Key reason for that is a number of in-year health allocations that's been added on the NHS side of the budget. It's to do with a number of allocations. COVID funding is in there, and specific bundled allocations as part of the outcomes framework. As a result of those changes to the budget, there's a requirement for new directions to be issued to both partners, and there's a separate paper on the agenda, so we will pick that back up later in terms of the implications for that. Moving on to section 4 of the report, which outlines the year-to-date results as at June. You can see from the table, it's on page 37 of the papers, an overspend of £225,000 was reported for the first 3 months of the financial year. That was mainly due to ongoing pressures within primary care, solely in relation to the cost of drugs prescribed mainly by GPs and dispensed in a community pharmacy, but also pressures within social care in terms of care at home services. Those two pressure areas have been offset by historic underspends within community healthcare services, and those relate specifically to recurring savings schemes from prior years that were successfully delivered, but the actual saving wasn't removed from the budget. So you can see there's an underspend in that line and overspends in other lines. So I'm looking to actually realign and rebase the budgets as a result of that, just to get things in the right place so that the report's actually more meaningful to members. In terms of actual COVID, I would draw your attention to page 39. The table just outlines that there's around £3.2 million worth of funding that's been issued in respect of COVID additional costs to date. Now, 1.7 million of that is in relation specifically to pressures in terms of social care. 990,000 is in respect of Strathcarron Hospice, and there's an amount that's still anticipated at this stage in relation to funding that went to GP practices to enable them to open during the April and May public holidays. We're expecting that funding to be issued soon, given that that was agreed between the Scottish Government and the British Medical Association, so that should be coming soon. In terms of the actual costs that's been incurred to date, I won't go through it in detail. You can see from the notes on page 40 of the paper, the common themes that won't surprise you to know are around financial sustainability for independent contractors and for providers. Of course, PPE and temporary staffing costs in terms of covering for absence in relation to sickness, shielding and any requirements around self-isolation. On a related issue, we've already picked up today around the delegated powers to myself and the Chief Officer around decision making during this pandemic response period, and Appendix 2 outlines a summary of all the decisions that's been taken to date. Moving on, looking ahead to the forecast outturn for the year, a £3.1 million overspend is forecast based on the available information at June. Obviously, since this report's been written, I've since received the July information, and that forecast overspend is at a similar level, so there hasn't been a great deal of change between the 2 months. £1.7 million of that overspend is in relation to the set-aside position, and that reflects a number of pressures within inpatient specialties in terms of locum cover, where there's been vacancies, and the assumption is that that will continue until the end of the financial year. So there's a separate paper on old age psychiatry specifically that we'll pick up later on the agenda in relation to that. The balance of 1.4 million relates to the integrated budget, and again that reflects those ongoing demand-led pressures around primary care and care at home in terms of social work. But there's also an element in there of unachieved savings, and I know we picked this up at the last meeting. There has been an impact on the savings plan in terms of COVID. I have included that in the mobilisation plan returns that we've submitted to the Scottish Government. However, as yet they have still not confirmed any funding specifically in relation to unachieved savings. Appendix 2 gives an overview of where we're at in terms of the savings. So there was a requirement for around £4.9 million worth of savings. Approximately £3 million of that is at risk at this stage. In terms of the adult social work position, there's 1.2 million is classed as amber at the moment. There may be scope actually to pull some of that towards green between the now and the remainder of the financial year. That's very much dependent on the impact of winter and second wave and the impact that that might have, but we are working really hard to actually get the teams to kind of refocus around the savings. Clearly, given that we are in September, time is of the essence as we approach between now and the end of March. So I think now the focus really does have to be on that savings plan and delivering that, including potential discussions around recovery planning if need be. And also, of course, we've picked up before around the risk sharing, and I would expect those discussions on the risk sharing to actually commence this month. That was just a really quick run through of the paper. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Gillian, and I'm pleased to hear that the Russian discussions will be starting soon. Obviously, there's quite a lot of things in the way at the moment, just one or two. I have a quick question about the recent announcement around additional funding for social care. And I know that some of that has come forward and some is not yet coming forward. And I just wondered if there's anything that we're expecting around additional funding in that respect.
Yep, so actually the allocation letters have just been issued to NHS Forth Valley this week, and another 722,000 has been issued. Again, that is specifically in relation to pressures against social care. So that's part of a share of £25 million. There was actually £50 million announced, you may be aware of that, but actually only half of it has been paid out at the moment. And again, that's subject to the continuing returns that we're submitting to Scottish Government in terms of the actual costs that we're incurring. And the health side, I know that Scottish Government are looking again at the returns that have been submitted, and I understand towards the end of September there's going to be an allocation in relation to health-related costs that's been incurred to date. Because as I say, any of the funding allocation just now has primarily been around social care, but they have been incurring significant costs on the health side as well.
Thank you, Gillian. Does anyone have any questions on the finance report? I think Gordon.
Yeah, I mean, it's more comment than question, Chair. I think our expectation all along has been that all direct costs that can be attributed to COVID will be paid by government, both in health and social care, and I'm pretty confident that will happen. The position in relation to unrealised savings has always been more opaque. And I have to say, I've always had a bad feeling that we will have to suck that up somewhere down the line. So I think it's one where we really need to plan on a worst case basis. And if worst case turns out not to be the case, it's a bonus.
Yeah, I agree, Gordon. Certainly in the template that Scottish Government has issued to collate the information around COVID, they are continuing to include that line for unachieved savings, so it is still in there. But as you say, there has been no discussion around it at all.
Thank you. Patricia.
It was just to build on what Gordon said. Even if Scottish Government were able to fund our gap that we're not able to deliver in savings this year, we would still have that next year, and it'll be a double whammy in terms of embedding recurring savings. So it's just to give members of the board the assurance that we are doing everything we can to shift those savings in from amber to green. Some of the red ones are more challenging because the amount of work that was needed to be done has been held back because of our COVID response. But we will do everything that we can in the knowledge that it is unlikely that that will be funded, but also we will just have a double challenge next year if we don't. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Do I have any more questions? And with that, we're happy to agree the recommendations. Thank you. And Gillian, again, we've got the review of the reserves.
Thanks. Yes, we agreed at the last meeting that a paper would be brought forward in terms of the reserves position, and the paper that you see today makes a number of recommendations in relation to the contingency reserve and in relation to earmarked reserves. So focusing on the contingency reserve first, the IJB's current reserve policy has a maximum recommended reserve balance capped at 440,000. Now, taking into account the number of strategic, operational and financial risks facing the IJB, thinking about, around the impact of COVID in terms of GP prescribing costs alone in the month of March, the impact of that was around 600k for 1 month. That 440 contingency reserve balance feels low. And it's certainly been commented by external audit as part of the prior year audit of the annual accounts. As a result of that, I'm recommending that we increase the maximum reserve balance in the reserves policy to just over £1 million, which is equivalent to 0.5% of our net expenditure. The current reserve balance is sitting at 316,000. I'm also recommending that 630k is transferred from earmarked reserves into the contingency reserve. Now that 630,000 is a historic balance that sat within earmarked reserves. It goes back to financial year 16-17. So if that was increased to the 316 balance we have, that would leave our contingency reserve sitting at 946,000. I have to point out that would be a non-recurring reserve. So if that reserve required to be used and was released, it would be gone. Ideally, you would be looking to have a recurring contingency reserve so that that money is available year after year. I appreciate that's really difficult in the current climate to achieve, but that's certainly a longer term aspiration that I'd like to get to. In terms of the earmarked reserves, now these are earmarked for specific purposes, and the focus of the paper is really on earmarked reserves that sit under the integration funding category. That's primarily partnership funds and leadership funds, and the balance of 630k is referred to as other, is what I've just said we would transfer. The recommendation would be into the contingency reserve. So on page 50, I think it should be in your report, you can see the table which just shows the breakdown of partnership funds and leadership funds. And board members will be well aware how the partnership funds element of that works. It operates in a 3-year cycle, and I understand that regular reports do come to the board outlining a number of projects and how that money has been taken forward. Now, the current financial year 2021 is actually the last year of the current 3-year funding programme, so there was always a need to actually look forward and develop the new 3-year programme. That new 3-year programme, was the work to develop that was supposed to start in March. Obviously, the impact of COVID-19 has delayed that. Now, the work is now underway as of September to develop that 3-year plan, and the expectation is that proposals would be brought forward to the IJIB in early financial year 2021. That gives enough time so that there's full engagement and consultation with a range of partners, stakeholders and colleagues in terms of how that programme is developed. So we're looking for support today around that. COVID as well is impacting on development of the new partnership funding projects. It's also had an impact on the current projects in the current financial year. So there's been a number of projects that have either had to be redesigned in terms of how they're supporting people, or some of them have been paused. So recognising that a number of projects are in a kind of restart, renewal or redesign phase, the recommendation today would be that where it's required, those projects could be extended into financial year 21-22. As I say, where it's required, it won't apply to all projects. And Appendix 4 in the papers gives a kind of summary of where we're at just now and the impact that COVID's had on some of the current projects. In terms of leadership funds, there's a £1 million recurring balance within leadership funds. There's also £1.39 million of non-recurring funds, which relates to underspends carried forward from previous years. In terms of the recommendations in relation to this reserve, I'm proposing that the £1 million recurring balance is actually transferred into service budgets, because it's actually already committed for a number of posts that's previously been approved by the IJIB. There has been some delays in the past recruiting to a number of these posts, but many of them are actually in post. And rather than issuing this money from reserves every year, it really should be transferred on a permanent basis into the service budgets where the post holders' costs are charged to. In terms of the £1.39 million non-recurring balance that sits in leadership funds, there's a number of recommendations for discussion today. So I'm proposing that £500,000 of that is used to create an innovation and invest to save type reserve. And that could be accessed by the locality teams and partners, really to pump prime some savings development and really innovative services and tests of change. Some of the feedback that we get back from a lot of the service managers is around the capacity to actually take forward savings. So if they had that dedicated time or a person to actually take forward some of the work, we've seen it being really successful in terms of some of the reviews of care packages for younger adults, where there has been somebody that's actually focused on doing the reviews, and it's actually improved outcomes for the patients and it's delivered savings, but having that dedicated resource. So that was the thinking around that. There was then a proposal to earmark £20,000 per locality, and I think this has been previously approved by the board, but again, due to delays in having people in post, that's around community development, and we've already heard the excellent work from Jen and Leslie this morning in the presentation around expanding that community development worker structure as well that's been in place previously. That would leave a balance then that I'm proposing that that's split equally between earmarking £415,000 to address health and social inequalities and unwanted variation in line with the national health and wellbeing outcomes and in relation to realistic medicine. And finally, another £415,000 around projects to support and maintain health and wellbeing across the Falkirk area. I'm happy to take any questions on the paper and would welcome your thoughts on those proposals.
Thank you very much, Gillian. It's a very full paper, and I certainly think that the point about supporting projects into the next financial year, if necessary, for those who've had to, for example, pause their work, I think to give some certainty to our partners as well, the proposals around the leadership funding. I certainly, been able to undertake activity in localities to look at, building on what Jen and Leslie were saying earlier on about really building on that work that's been happening over COVID and taking that forward to support our local citizens. So I'm going to open it up to questions or comments. Any questions or comments? Jen.
Yes, I just want to welcome and say thank you for the recognition of the stability for the third sector services in the programmes, and the fact that we haven't been able to start some of the recommissioning and redesign processes that we want. So anything around co-design and service user involvement that we can help with, please ask. I guess in terms of the way forward with the community, and the funds around that, I guess I think what we've learned is we probably need some time and space to talk to communities about what they actually need in terms of resources themselves, rather than resourcing ourselves a little bit more to help them. I think I'd rather see resources going much more directly into communities after what I've seen, and it might not even be as much, so maybe let's some savings in that.
Thanks, Jen. Patricia?
Just to support what Jen was saying, the intent is that we have those additional resources around concrete work to address inequalities, but also the whole health and wellbeing agenda, and that would be very much developed at a community and a locality level. So thank you.
Thank you very much. If there are no other comments or questions, are we happy to agree the recommendations? Get some nods. Thank you very much. Keep on accidentally muting myself. Back to Gillian again for a report on directions.
Thank you. So the report was actually originally intended to come to the March IJB meeting that was scheduled for the 20th of March 2020, but obviously due to COVID, I know that meeting dealt with urgent business only, so this was the paper was published but wasn't specifically discussed. Obviously, I've mentioned as part of the finance report that there is a requirement for new directions to be issued to both partners. Those budget changes mean that has to be done. But this paper actually highlights that there was statutory guidance published by Scottish Government back in January around directions and how they should be issued and the processes around that. So I won't go through the paper in detail, but I would draw your attention to what it means in terms of our current process and the changes that we need to make. So the statutory guidance recommends that each IJB should develop a directions policy, and the proposal here would be that that is developed and brought back to the November IJB meeting. From November 2020, the next IJB meeting, it is recommended that we change the format of our reports so that there is a standing item within the reports around whether a direction is in fact required. So we could do that quite easily. We already have the standing items around resource implications and the impact on IJB's outcomes and priorities. So I would see it fitting in within that section, and the report author would be asked to consider whether a direction is required. In terms of the directions themselves, the statutory guidance dictates that they actually should be relatively detailed, and there's a template included in the paper at Appendix 1 to this particular report that suggested that we could develop going forward. There also requires to be a log, unsurprisingly, and that could be easily maintained through myself in terms of those directions and how they've been changing over the year. So that's the kind of key changes that's required as a result of the process. I think it's actually relatively straightforward, so I would hope that the board would be content to agree those today, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, and I think it makes perfect sense to include the need for directions within reports. I think that makes perfect sense, and I think certainly our group discussions around collaborative leadership, we certainly had quite a good discussion on directions and about clarity and about detail. So I think that a policy and that clarity, it would be very helpful. I'm going to open it up to any questions or comments. No, doesn't look like there's any. So with that, are we happy to agree the report? Great. Thank you very much. And I'm back to Gillian again for the strategic risk register.
Sorry. Yep. So the paper on the strategic risk register, this part of a 6-monthly review that comes to the IJB, so it is that time again. The table on page 85 gives a high-level overview of the current position of the risks. So these were reviewed by the leadership group, sorry, in July actually. It's normally reviewed quarterly by leadership group and the audit committee. So it was done virtually to review the risks. You can see that there's 11 active risks, 10 of which are currently considered as high risk and 1 which is low risk. So these risks have been categorised in terms of their impact on the delivery of the strategic plan. So that's risks 1 to 5 in the table. Specific risks around performance and quality issues, that's risks 6 and 7. And other specific high-level risks are risks 8 to 11. The risk register will be presented at the next audit committee meeting towards the end of this month. And I would actually be hoping for quite a focused discussion at the audit committee around some of these risks. I'm conscious that some of them have been high for quite a period now. So it's important that we actually look at what other actions and controls we can put in place so that when the next come to the IGB, we can be presenting a movement in these risks in a positive direction. So I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much. And Alison, I'll bring you in at that point.
There's just 3 questions regarding specifics in the register. The first in 92, the ADP. I mean, Elaine Waller's been doing some sterling work here, keeping things going, but we still have an ongoing issue relating to drug deaths, and I think it's a really important area, and we need to have the staff in place to make sure that we can do the best job we can. So what about the service leads and the governance arrangements? How's things going with progressing that? I've got that question and a couple of other questions.
I think Patricia wants to come in on that.
Thank you, Alison. We are currently in discussions with the NHS Chief Exec, Andrew Murray, and other senior colleagues about the model for clinical leadership for mental health and whether or not the ADP would sit within that. So those are ongoing discussions at the moment with Clarkson Stirling IGB as well. So we would hope to be bringing information on that back to the IGB in due course. And that is something that we're very actively looking at the moment. Martin leads on the ADP, and I don't know if he's got anything else to add, but it's certainly one of the areas of joint services that we're in active discussions currently. Thank you.
I think it's really important that addiction services sit and mental health services are closely aligned. The other thing I was going to, I've got a couple of other things to ask, was the work being done started last September about the organisational development and page 102. Do we have a time frame for when that work will be completed?
So we currently have an ongoing programme with our staff teams down to service manager and clinical nurse manager level. And that's been going since last December. The original programme was 2 days intensive work and then 1 day a month. Those monthly meetings were paused during COVID, but we replaced them with other virtual focus sessions for staff on emerging issues that they'd identified. So we got back together as a group about 3 weeks ago, and it's really quite remarkable the feedback we're getting from our staff. COVID has helped accelerate joint working, but also they've all fed back very positively about this ongoing programme. It will run until December of this year, but certainly is really supporting integrated and joint work planning and delivery, but also each session that we have a view from the front line or from the communities. So our most recent session, we had 2 of the community volunteers in feeding how they experienced COVID and the work that they were able to do, setting up some of the responses in the community that Jen has described earlier. Previously, we've had individuals from the staff team coming, telling us what it feels like to be a member of some of our teams. So some really positive leadership development work alongside some of the joint training programmes that we are setting up and will set up. I would also like to have an annual service conference, partnership conference, so that we can bring people together at least once a year on particular themes in relation to the strategic plan. Obviously, we're not able to do that this year, but it's very much an ambition that we have for the next year, should we be in a better position in relation to COVID. I don't know if that answers all of your questions, but we are at team level doing quite a lot of work, and we would expect at a locality level that to go into more of a deeper dive as well.
No, that's good. It sounds like that particular part of the paper shouldn't be at red, it should probably be at green. just that, one more thing, in page 106, obviously the primary implementation plan, we got turned down for the extra funding, and has there been another meeting since then? Because that funding was vital.
I understand that they haven't had another meeting as yet, but I know that the Leeds have contacted the Scottish Government a couple of times now, actually, to try and get a meeting, but the response has been, that they've been dealing with COVID. But certainly we have submitted iteration 3 of the primary care improvement plan. We stuck to the original timescales and submitted it, but I don't think any other area has at the moment. I think those discussions are about to open back up, because they have now asked other areas to submit it, albeit a bit later. But as I say, we've already submitted ours, so we are trying to demonstrate that we're ahead of the game.
Thank you, Gillian and Patricia. Alison, is that any further questions? Okay, that's great. Do you have any other questions from anyone else on the board? No. Well, with that, we can approve the paper and move on to our next paper, which is Old Age Psychiatry Services. And Patricia's yourself.
Thank you, Chair. This is a paper for the board to note. There's a cover paper with the paper that was submitted to NHS Forth Valley and approved on the 25th of August, and that is to recruit an additional 4 consultants for the old age psychiatry service. Over the last number of years, there have been vacancies in the service that have been filled by locums, a series of locums, and that's been identified as a risk nationally as part of the Strang review in Tayside. And this is a proposal to rebalance the budget and potentially employ 4 permanent consultants, given that the Health Board has carried a risk, albeit an overspend, on agency costs over the number of years. And this was just old age psychiatry is one element of the medical budget that is in the large hospital set aside for the Integration Joint Board. So it's just to bring this to the board's attention that decision and a potential significant improvement in the consistency and the quality of the service, which should result as a result of this action. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. I think that makes sense to try to permanent posts rather than using locum cover. In my view, but I wondered how this links in, or does it link in with the work in terms of community psychiatry? Patricia?
It will link into that broader discussion that I referred to earlier about us looking with Andrew Murray and Cathy and others at the clinical leadership models to support both the partnerships and the mental health, primary care and community services.
Thank you. Do you have any questions? None? Okay, thank you very much. With that, are we happy just to note the content of the report? Thank you very much. And I'd like to move on to self-directed support update. And we have Margaret Petherbridge and Martin Tom. Margaret, are you presenting?
Yes, yeah. Apologies, I've not got access to IT just now, so I'll need to switch between screens if I have to try and access the paper on my iPad. But basically, it's just to give the Integration Joint Board an update on self-directed support and our progress towards implementation, and just to ask if the IJB would note that progress. Obviously, things have changed significantly as a result of COVID-19, but just prior to that, we had decided to completely review the strategy for implementation of self-directed support, and we'd undertaken quite a significant piece of work in terms of mapping the outcomes that are required for successful implementation. So we looked at a variety of things. We looked at the recommendations within the Audit Scotland report that was produced in 2017, which are still relevant. Last year, the Care Inspectorate carried out a thematic SDS inspection across 6 authorities in Scotland, and last June they published the report on that, and that also contained a series of recommendations. Those recommendations actually fitted really quite well with the recommendations in the Audit Scotland report, and the Care Inspectorate reported some evidence of really good practice, but also some gaps in practice and learning in relation to that. The Scottish Government had commissioned some work to try and refresh their approach to self-directed support implementation as well, and they developed a change map as a result of that. So we have incorporated the outcomes identified as priority within that change map as well, and the Scottish Government then produced an updated implementation plan covering 2019 to 2021 in terms of their priorities for implementation. That was published in December 2019. So what we've done is we mapped all of that. We looked at what progress that we had made within the Falkirk Partnership, and we've had, just prior to COVID, to lockdown happening, we'd really begun to drill down into that to look at developing a refreshed action plan for implementation. Now, some of that work has been delayed a bit, but it's not that we're not working on it, we still are. But there are 3 main areas that we're working on. One is in relation to people having improved choice and control, having access to appropriate support, including independent support in relation to making choices about their support, which happens through our local support organisation, Self-Directed Support Forth Valley, and also looking at how we are communicating with our citizens around self-directed support. The second area is in relation to our workforce, and we have been trying to continue on with workforce development, working really closely with our partners, in particular Self-Directed Support Forth Valley and also the Carer Centre, but also with our workforce development manager, and trying to pull all of that together. So we've identified some priorities in relation to things like the Good Conversations training, making sure that that's embedded, making sure that workers have access to good information and support. We are looking now at trying to do some online briefing sessions. We were doing them face-to-face, and we were running them 3 to 4 times a year, both for the carers work and for self-directed support. So we're working with Self-Directed Support Forth Valley just now, because they've developed some really good online tools, and we're looking at how we can start to use them for our own workforce, but they're also being used with service users and carers as well. Workforce Development Manager is off sick just now, but when she comes back, we've agreed that she and I will meet with SDS Forth Valley to look at those tools. We're also making use of the SSSC resources that are available, and I know that there's work that is happening with Forth Valley College as well in relation to developing really good digital access for workforce development. So that's all ongoing. And the other part of it, the third area, was the systems and leadership in relation to self-directed support. So that incorporates things like our contracts and commissioning, and making sure that commissioning is developed around outcomes. We're looking at things like legal support for contracts and commissioning for the contractual part also for making sure that we update our GDPR, and we were in the process of doing that in relation to the SDS contracts when we went into lockdown. So I'm still working with Alistair Steele in legal services to bring that to fruition. In terms of systems, as you know, we're replacing Swiss, so we have tried to embed a process within the new Liquid Logic and the finance system that is intuitive in relation to self-directed support and leads workers through a process that incorporates self-directed support into everything that they're doing. And one of the really important aspects of that for us is making sure that workers are recording the conversations they're having with people, including recording the agreed outcomes and the option that's chosen and the reason why that option has been agreed to be the best option for that person. That was one of the significant recommendations within the Care Inspectorate report. So we're really trying to make sure that we embed that. And over the last couple of years, we've actually done some quite in-depth analysis around how things are recorded on Swiss, which is not intuitive, but working with staff to help them to kind of work around that, I suppose, because they're having to almost have the good conversations and then translate things into a format that's acceptable to Swiss. But when we move into Liquid Logic, that should be much more intuitive. In terms of the actual recording, we are seeing an increase in options recorded. As I say, on Swiss, we can't really get a lot more detail about that other than the option has been recorded. So we know recording is improving. What we really need to get to in terms of our outcomes is making sure that regardless of which option it is, that we know that the outcomes are being met in the most flexible way possible for that individual, whether it's us that are arranging and paying for the support or whether the individual is taking control of that. So there's a whole range of things that are ongoing that we continue to work on even during COVID. We have to some extent been hampered by COVID, but it's presented some opportunities as well. So we're undergoing a piece of work just now with carers to look at how we can support them much more flexibly during COVID, and we're finding some really creative ways of doing that. We wrote out to all of our short break carers, and we're getting lots of response back from them just now about different things that we can do to support them using an SDS approach. So hopefully that's given you a good overview of the work that we have been doing or continue to do, and we are making progress, and we'll continue to make sure that we do that.
Thank you very much, Margaret. As you know, this is something that I'm extremely interested in, and moving forward for people to have the full choice about what support best meets their outcomes and best meets their needs. I think it sounds like an excellent strategy, and there's been a great deal of work going on, and I know we have the conversations about things not being able to be done by during COVID, but actually a lot of things have been carried out. They've just been carried out in a different way.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important to say that. So I very much look forward to seeing the refreshed action plan and hearing the results. And with my interest in carers, it's excellent to hear the work with the Carer Centre around how the carers can use SDS more flexibly during this period. So thank you very much for that, and I'd like to open it up to questions. Jen.
Just a comment on, obviously, is that my feedback? Sorry. Okay. The impact on the third sector could be great, and linking that to some of the commissioning review, because obviously as SDS progresses and more people use that choice, there's less need for sort of block commissioning of contracts. So just to say, some third sector services probably need some time to think that through and prepare for it. It's different to earn your income on a client by client basis than it is to earn it on a contract basis once a year. So when it gets to that stage, really welcome being involved in that, and probably actually something for our partnership to think about in our market facilitation plan that we've been working on up until this point. I don't think actually we've kind of taken SDS into account in that, but actually it does affect commissioning. You're right, it does. Liquid Logic will give us different information about what people actually want. And we need to sort of support the market to ensure that's there. And again, I've seen some really creative ways when you start to engage with service users about what could be done, cooperatives being developed based on choices of what people want, because we can't build a market for everything. We can't afford that. But we can, you know, tap into people that are out there if we set that up properly and we have good frameworks and things. So there's actually quite a lot of commissioning and sort of structure that we need and thought that needs to go in to support the third sector to be able to respond well to that. So happy to help with that. Would really like to be able to prepare the third sector well for that. And also just to account a bit differently for income as well. So just to say there's a bit of technical work behind that for the third sector to be involved well with that. So I'm pleased to see you're working so close to the third sector already, where you're already working with carers. Great. But get in touch when you get to the wider third sector aspects of it.
Thanks, Jane. We obviously would be really happy to work with you on that. And on the carers part of it, we are working with organisations like Citizens Advice as well in relation to income maximisation for carers and other things. We're working with the Falkirk District Association for Mental Health around supporting families around mental health and particular carers and young carers. And we're in discussion with I've forgotten that it's the organisation that supports people with addictions, and I've forgotten what their proper name is, the family support group, around some of the work that they want to do for carers as well. So I'm more than happy to engage with you in that work.
Very much. Any other comments or questions? No? Happy then to note the report. And finally, I'm going on to 14, that's already happened. Agenda item 15 is the minutes of committees and groups. And I think probably it's just an opportunity if there's any questions that anyone has on them. Obviously they can be asked later if need be, but just those are noted. Does anyone have anything they want to add to that? No. I think that's the last paper. So thank you very much, everybody, for your attendance today. I think we've had some really good information and papers and discussion. So look forward to seeing you all at the next meeting, or of course some VLC in between. So thank you very much.